thank you again for inviting me to talk. I'm excited to talk to you all. I'm going to start with some initial introductions to myself, my collaborator, Rashab Nithyanan on this project, and the working group that we're a part of. And then I'm going to talk about our current research project that deals with algorithmic personalization and online radicalization. All right, so that's the two of us. So we were, Rashab and I were, as Juliana said, we were awarded summer in residence fellowships this summer with the PPC. Rashab is, he's currently in London dealing with a personal matter. And so I'm kind of filling in, but speaking on behalf of both of us today. So I'm in the School of Journalism, Mass Communication. I've been here since 2011. I research digital media, media production, and then I also do a lot of international media research. So my dissertation and a lot of my work is actually focused on East Africa and Kenya specifically. But I have a background in computer science. I've always been interested in digital media. Rashab is an assistant professor in computer science at Iowa. He got his PhD from from Stony Brook University in 2018, and he's been at Iowa for the past couple of years. And he studies, he's leading a group, let's see what it's called. It's called the Security, Privacy, and Anonymity Research Team at Iowa. So he's got kind of a cohort of graduate students that he's leading on various projects about internet security, anonymity, things like that. So yeah, we were very fortunate to receive the Summer Scholar in Residence grant to work together. Rashab and I have been collaborators for a couple of years with this large group that I'll talk about in a second. But one of the downsides is that, since we're coming from different departments and we all have our various things going on, we've been getting together every week and we can kind of share ideas for an hour or so at a time, and then we kind of go our separate ways. And we thought, wouldn't it be a great opportunity to spend a month together in a space and actually get to exchange ideas on a regular basis, which is what brought us to this PPC program. As you know, things didn't quite work out as planned. The pandemic made it so that we couldn't actually be in the same space. And it just added a few other challenges. My wife and I have a daughter who all of her summer camps were canceled. And so we were managing childcare responsibilities. You may hear her make noises here and then. And the other thing that happened, besides kind of that logistical hassle, is that a week into our residency, we found we were going to be using this residency to work on a NSF grant proposal. A week into our residency, we found that we received a large grant to do some research. And so rather than push forward on another large grant, we decided to just turn our focus into that grant that we did receive. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about, is kind of our work that's been on that particular project. And I should give some thanks to some folks that I see in here as well. So who were really helpful in doing that. I see Kate is in here, and Chris Ackerson was really helpful in helping us. Lisa was really helpful in helping us figure out everything we needed for the grant. So I'd never done one of these before. And so I leaned a lot on other people to help me get through it. And it was incredibly helpful. So this is the research group that this comes out of. So in 2016, Tim Havens, the fella in the middle there, he was working on a research study about Netflix's algorithm, the personalization algorithm that Netflix uses. And he thought, hey, wouldn't it be fun to get people all around campus together to talk about algorithms from all sorts of different perspectives? And so he teamed up with the Obermann Center. We've been affiliated with the Obermann Center ever since then, and started bringing together people from communication studies, where he's from, journalism, where I'm from, computer science, mathematics, engineering. We have just a bunch of people sitting around a table trying to say, like, well, how do you talk about algorithms? What do algorithms mean to you? Eventually, we kind of filtered down to this group of 6 and started working on a research project together. So Zubair Shafiq is in the yellow shirt in front. He was in computer science, is no longer here. And then a couple other folks from computer science and communication studies were there. And we eventually worked on a research study that was looking at the Google News algorithm and how your search results might change based on what you do in the past and what that reveals about you. This is what we look like now. We don't meet in person anymore. We don't get to touch each other, put hugs around each other, anything like that. So we're pretty much exclusively a Skype group at the moment, in part because Andy High, who's in the top corner here, was a professor here. He's now at Penn State. Raven Mirage Lloyd, who was a graduate student here, is now a professor at Gonzaga. And we have a couple new faces. So Rashab is there, and his graduate student, John, and my graduate student, Ryan, are here. And so this is what our research groups look like for the time being. Last fall, this group worked on a large grant proposal for a Department of Defense project called the Minerva Research Initiative, which funds social science research. We submitted that, and then a couple months after we spent a long time working on this grant proposal, we heard through the news that the program was getting cut, that the administration decided they no longer wanted to fund the program, and they zeroed out the budget, which was disappointing for us who had spent a lot of time doing it. So we had essentially moved on with our lives and were working on other things like the NSF project that Rashab and I had proposed for this, and then found out over the summer that in fact the funding hadn't been cut and our project was awarded. So we got tremendous news about 7 months later than we thought we were going to get it, but that has been an exciting thing. And so what I want to talk about is that project, what it looks like, and what we're doing right now. So this is the project that we submitted with the title of the talk today. So Algorithmic Personalization and Online Radicalization, a Mixed Method Approach. And here are all the folks that were listed as PIs on the project. Before I talk about what we're going to be doing with the specific project, I want to kind of point out maybe the two key ideas that are driving this project and make sure I explain what we mean by that before we kind of explain what we wanted to learn and how we're going about doing it. So let's start with algorithmic personalization or personalization algorithms. I'm sure you hear algorithms being thrown around a lot. They're kind of trendy as a thing to study, in part because they're very mysterious. And so I wanted to hopefully make them a little bit less mysterious. So as we talk about it, an algorithm, it's essentially just a decision-making process, right? A process for making decisions, often based on a set of rules. Now, we use algorithms all the time in functioning in our day-to-day lives, right? When we are running a series of errands and we figure out what's the order do I want to run those errands? Am I going to get my groceries and then Target and then pick up the dog? What's the order I'm going to be doing those things? That's an algorithm that helps us decide. When we try to figure out what gifts we're going to buy people for Christmas, we have an algorithm that decides what's about the money I want to spend. What are their interests, right? We're connecting these pieces together. Even when you go to the mall and you're deciding, where do I park? Okay, well, I need to go to this store first, but I want to end up here, and I'm going to buy the heaviest thing at this place, right? You make these decisions about where you're going to park. Algorithms are essentially just processes we do all the time. What's happening now is we live in an increasingly digitized world where these algorithms are being handled by computers. Computers are making decisions for us, and they're making these decisions based on a set of rules. The reason we want to examine algorithms is not because they're mysterious, but the consequences can actually be quite big. So we're seeing algorithms that are being used in the criminal justice system to decide what should be the bail or what are the sentences based on a variety of variables that are entered in here. We see algorithms being used in finance to decide who should get a loan and at what rate. We're seeing algorithms used in healthcare, deciding who should be treated in which order. Those have really large consequences. So it's important that we understand what are the processes that are making that happen. And what makes computer algorithms particularly interesting is that for the most part, we can't see, right? If you have someone in charge of making all the loan decisions for a bank, you can go up to that person and you can interrogate, well, why did you do this and not this and do this and not this? You can't really ask a code that. You can't ask a machine that. And so the study of algorithms is trying to figure out what are these decision-making processes and what are the thought processes behind them. Now, we also see this in digital social media as well, right? Digital and social media use algorithms to personalize your experience online. Your experience is different from anyone in your family or one of your friends or strangers. Everyone's experience is a little bit different. And that's because these social and digital platforms, they try to figure out what your interests and your preferences are, and they customize your experience based on what those interests and preferences are. One easy way to kind of visualize this is, I imagine many of us have a Facebook account. When you go onto Facebook and you look at your news feed, you see some posts by some people. Well, why aren't you seeing posts from other people? Why are you seeing posts from these people? Why are you seeing only these types of posts from an individual, but not others? So I'm going to pull the chat up here as well. So feel free to interrupt if you have a question or throw something into the chat. I'm happy to pause and explain. So this is something that showed up on my newsfeed. So why did Facebook decide this is the type of content I want? Well, it's making a guess based on my previous interactions, maybe the posts I comment on, maybe the posts I like, maybe the people that I engage with, maybe the people that I've indicated are my immediate family. That's what Facebook is likely to show me. It's not always giving us the stuff we like. I mean, we've all been online and sometimes you engage with content that makes you mad, right? Maybe there's someone that you kind of hate follow on Twitter or on Facebook. And so you might see more of their content because it keeps you on the site. So it's not necessarily always content that's going to make you happy, but it's going to be content that makes you come back and spend more time on the site. Now, these decisions are value laden, right? So it's easy for computer scientists to say that an algorithm is neutral, but none of these decisions are neutral. They're based on a value system that maybe is reflected by the user, but is also reflected by the coder and reflects the context in which these come in, which might have racial biases, gender biases, nationality biases as well. So what we know to a certain extent is that this personalization can reinforce our existing biases, right? There's an idea in communication and political science literature that talks about selective exposure, where we seek out content that reflects our pre-existing opinions. We're more likely to find that type of content. Well, if we are seeking out that content and then algorithms are being trained to learn from our behavior, they are going to feed us more of that. And so you might get this spiraling effect where you seek out content that agrees with you, the algorithm gives you more of that content, and so on and so forth. So we wanted to look at, well, what happens as, can this spiral out of control? And does it spiral evenly for everyone? Or are some people more susceptible to the spiraling than others? So our research is really looking at which type of people are vulnerable to this type of spiraling towards what we consider radicalization. Now, radicalization, a lot of the research on the topic is looking at radical Islamic extremism. That's not the type of radicalization we're interested in. We're interested in a radicalization that can be in a variety of different topics, but essentially has three dimensions to it. And those dimensions are the belief extremity, right? So how fringe one's views are, right? What is someone's position on a topic relative to the mainstream position or relative to the center or relative to a moderate position, right? An extreme belief on an issue. The second dimension is the strength of that belief, how strongly someone might feel that they have that belief, like how certain they are that they're right, how crystal clear, or are they willing to consider alternative viewpoints or to try to see things another way. And then the third dimension is essentially what are the tactics that that person would engage in or would in support of their belief, right? Would they be willing to engage in any violent behavior, or would they condone violent behavior in support of the beliefs that they hold? So radicalization really has these three dimensions. So we're not saying that if you hold opinion that is far from the mainstream, that you're necessarily a radical. But if you hold an opinion very, very far from the mainstream, you hold it with absolute certainty, and that you would justify, amoral means to accomplish that, and that puts you in the category of radicalization. And the other thing we're thinking about as well is that we're talking about radicalization as a process, right? It's the process of becoming more and more radicalized. Your opinion's becoming more and more extreme, becoming more or stronger, I should say, or that you might condone more and more tactics. And so looking at the relationship between digital media and that process, right? So what is the relationship between someone becoming choosing more content and getting more content that reflects their views, and the process of becoming radicalized? So these are the research questions that really drive this study. So we want to look at what are the individual variables, right? So what's the makeup of an individual that could be associated with radicalization? And there's research that looks at radicalization or extremism or partisanship. So we do have some research in that, but not much has looked at the relationship between media and technology in radicalization. The second question that drives our work is what types of online content are associated with radicalization, right? If we see someone becoming radicalized, are they consuming a particular type of content, whether that is news content, blog content, social media content? Can we see a relationship between content being consumed and radicalization? We also don't know how people necessarily make sense of personalization in radical content they encounter online. This is more of a humanistic question, right? Trying to understand how do people conceive of algorithms and how does that affect their relationship with technology? What does someone do when they see a post on Facebook that is really extreme or radical? How do they respond to it? How do they make sense of that? And then the last question is really, can we predict when a community is likely to become radicalized, right? Can we use advanced computational methods to try to figure out, is one community more likely to become radicalized than another? So this is a mixed method study. We've just begun working on the project, so I'm going to outline the methods that we're using for this so that I can give a sense of how we intend to answer those questions that I proposed. So I'm going to go through the 4 methods quickly, and then I'll walk through each of them individually. So there'll be a longitudinal survey, meaning we're going to field a survey once, and then a year later, we'll field the same survey. That will allow us to measure change over time. We're going to do online behavioral tracking. So we're going to be able to track where people go, what are the websites they visit, how long they're on those websites. So the browser histories of users. We're going to do some in-depth interviews with a smaller number of participants to try to get at some of the sense-making strategies, the interpretive strategies people use when they engage with personalization and radical content. And then that last component is a predictive algorithm. And I can talk a little bit about this, but this is much more Rishabh's zone than mine, but it's figuring out a computational way to figure out, is an online community likely to become radicalized, right? To go from engaged to extreme. So the survey, which is what we're spending a lot of time on right now, you're going to have a few variables that look at the relationship between individual characteristics and radicalization. There has been research to look at things like dogmatism, personal hardship, social capital, right? If someone feels like they have no social capital and lonely, they're more vulnerable to be radicalized. If someone has endured personal hardships, right? Death in the family, loss of job, dissolution of a marriage, those things are more likely to lead to radicalization. So we have some of those variables, but we want to look at these media and technology variables as well. What are the sites that people are using? Why do they use them? What is their algorithmic literacy? Do they understand how content is being presented to them? What that means? What is their tendency to engage in selective exposure, to choose content that reinforces their viewpoints? And we want to see how these media and technology variables interact with some of these other variables that have been known to be related to radicalization, right? Are they mediated or moderated by these different variables? And then we're going to assess people's views on 4 topics. And these are 4 topics that we picked for a few reasons. They're kind of long-standing and contentious issues in the US. So we looked at Pew statistics for the past several elections, and they were always listed in the top 10. They're also topics that have examples of people engaging in extreme or violent behavior related to them. And so these are race and racial inequity, immigration, abortion, and climate change. And so for each of these issues, we're going to measure those 3 dimensions we talked about. What is the extremity of one's position, right? So how far they might go on one side or the other based on that topic. The strength of it, so the clarity with which they have their viewpoint and how certain they are about it. And then the last is kind of the tactics used or supported. So I'm just going to flash up a couple samples of what these questions would look like on the topic of immigration. So this would be for assessing someone's stance on a position, right? So how they fit on the topic of illegal immigration. And most of these are survey scales that have been validated in previous studies. So this would be on understanding their position on immigration. This is, it's a scale about clarity, attitude, clarity, and certainty. So how certain that you, the topic, or the stance that you indicated is your true stance, but then how certain is your stance, how certain are you that your stance is the right one or superior to other viewpoints? And then we want to look at some tactics, and there's this survey research that has a scale that looks at both activist tactics and then violent tactics or radical tactics. And so you might have activist tactics like belonging to an organization that fights for your rights or volunteering your time to work for it. But then we have more radical tactics like I would continue to support an organization even if that organization breaks the law or even if that organization resorts in violence. To this, we want to add some digitally specific tactics. And so we talk about joining an online community, publicly disagreeing with someone on social media, disconnecting with someone, so unfriending or unfollowing someone who has a different viewpoint than yours. So these are the types of things that we want to measure. And the benefit of doing a longitudinal study is we can measure someone's viewpoint at the beginning, measure the viewpoint at the end, and then we can look at the change over time, right? So we can see that radicalization. We're not necessarily just trying to identify people who have been radicalized, but we're trying to identify that process. And there may be a certain amount of de-radicalization as well, right? Someone becoming less radicalized, maybe less condoning of extreme tactics in their view. The second piece of this is a behavioral tracking component. And essentially this is just, we're going to get a list of websites that participants visit. So some portion of the people who do the survey, if they volunteer, we will track what they do online, what websites they visit. And we'll get a list like, listed below, right? Maybe someone is going to Fox News, Drudge Report, Breitbart, Facebook. And overall, we'll be able to connect this with some of the data that we are acquiring through the survey. And although the survey will tell us about attitudes and what they think, this behavioral tracking will show us what they actually do online, right? What is the behavior? What are the sites that they go to visit? The third method we're employing are in-depth interviews. These are basically, we're trying to get at how users make sense of personalization and how they respond when they see radical content online. So we'll ask some questions that allow us to get more nuanced information. Surveys are great for getting a lot of information from a lot of people that is quantifiable that you can do statistical analyses on. But sometimes the nuance is lost. And so this allows people to use their own words to give us their experiences in everyday life. And this will include some social media tasks as well, where we're going to ask participants to do some things, and then we're going to ask them some questions about it. So one will be related to Facebook, one will be related to Google, and one will be related to YouTube. And I can just show you quickly what that YouTube portion will look like. We're going to send participants a link to open for a video, right? So this is a video called Critical Race Theory is Racist. We're going to ask them to load that up and then take a look at what are the recommendations that YouTube lists beside the video. There's the up next, so the video that would be played next, but other videos that it thinks the user would be interested in. We're going to ask them to take a look at those, and then we're going to have them take a look at ones that would show up from a different computer and ask them to try to make sense of the differences, right? So why would a clean computer looking at this video have an opportunity to watch a John Oliver video or be suggested a John Oliver video, but not you, right? There are certainly some same videos that pop up from list to list, but there are some differences there as well. And these are just screenshots I took on my computer last night, right? And so, if we have more variety, we'd be able to see what this looks like. But we're gonna ask people to try to make sense of personalization. How do you understand it? Why do you think you're getting this content? That gets us more at some of the interpretive strategies that help make sense of how people engage with social media on a day-to-day basis. With those three pieces, combining the survey, the tracking, and the interviews, we can see a really well-rounded picture, right? We can triangulate this data, and we can start to look at the attitudes and other variables captured through the survey. We can look at the behaviors captured through the tracking, and then we can look at some of the interpretive strategies captured through the interviews and connect them back with these radicalization dimensions, the extremity on a position, the strength of a position, and the tactics used. And so we're hoping to get a really kind of well-rounded picture of this relationship between personalization and radicalization online. So that leaves us one component left of the study, and this is going to kind of come on the tail end of it all. This is the predictive algorithm. And again, this is much more in the realm of the computer science. So I will try my best to explain it. The idea behind this is we want to take a look at existing online communities that have become radicalized. So there's been a number of communities on Reddit, 4chan, Facebook, other sites that have been kicked off the sites because they have become essentially a form of radicalized. The types of behavior that they engage in and they promote and they support in those communities work against the policies of these platforms. Well, we can take a look at those communities and try to identify what are some of the key moments in the radicalization, right? When that community started, it didn't start radicalized. How did it get from point A to point B? What are some of these key markers that came along the way, right? Was there a recruitment process? Was there a point where the tone changed, where opponents were dehumanized and no longer treated as, equal partners, but were treated as animals? Is there a point in time where violence or other types of extremist behavior becomes sanctioned or condoned or even supported? So if we take a bunch of communities and we can start to label what that lifespan of that community looks like, this is where you can train a machine learning algorithm. So what you do is you do all this manual work and then you feed it into a computer so that computer can learn, all right, this is what a community looks like as it becomes radicalized. We can then apply that to existing online communities to get a sense of, are these communities vulnerable to becoming radicalized? Are they following a similar lifespan to these ones that we've seen before? So this predictive algorithm really sits on top of the other three pieces, because that's going to tell us a lot about personalization and algorithms. And then this is going to actually kind of see what it looks like in existing communities that exist online. So those are the four pieces of this project. And this is a 3-year grant. So we've got some time to kind of work our way through these big pieces here. But to just kind of to wrap up, and I'll leave plenty of time to answer questions as well. This is why we think it matters, right? This is what we're trying to accomplish. From a research perspective, we want to, what are these personal attributes and what are the online behaviors that are associated with radicalization, right? What type of people are more likely to become radicalized? What type of content that people visit online is associated with radicalization? Within that, we want to understand, like, how do people make sense of it, right? The interviews are really going to give us some of these strategies people use to make sense of personalization. Like I said, sometimes you might be getting content on social media because you like it. Sometimes you might be getting content because you hate it. And so people play with algorithms in different ways, right? Because, I'm someone that when I get a survey that pops up on YouTube before I have to watch the video, I answer falsely all the time. I just put weird answers because I don't want them to know who I am, right? And so there are different ways that people kind of hack and play with algorithms as well. And that's part of what we want to make sense, some of the strategies people use. We'd like to be able to get to a point where we can start to predict what online communities are vulnerable to radicalization. We don't necessarily think we can identify all communities that are going to be radicalized, but we can start to get a sense of what are the attributes that make one vulnerable to radicalization, and what might be ways that we would want to intervene in that. And then in terms of, this is particularly common in computer science, when you design some kind of innovative methodology, you want to provide that back to the public so people can use that on their own. So, so the first would be a methodology for auditing personalization, which is basically being able to run computer programs to simulate what personalization would look like. And then also a methodology for doing this community evolution toward extremism, right? So if we find a methodology that lets us study what this looks like, we can provide that back to the public as well. In terms of the policy significance of this, I think for the platforms themselves, hopefully we would be able to provide them some strategies for identifying these radicalized communities to make these spaces a little less toxic. If we can identify these communities and hopefully reduce some of the unsafe real world consequences that can come from these radicalized communities. But then also, for politicians and elected officials, we hope that our findings can inform appropriate regulation. As you may be paying attention to, social media industries have really not been regulated since they came about. And there's increasingly a conversation of, okay, there should be some form of regulation, but figuring out exactly what that regulation should be is less clear. So we're hoping that our research can provide some context for understanding what is the type of regulation that would be useful to have of these social media industries. And then, because our group is interdisciplinary, we're really trying to think about, we've come together as a group and we think about things in very different ways. And that sometimes makes the work hard, but it makes it really rewarding as well, because we're really receptive and trying to learn how different people think. And so there is, the survey methodology comes from a more social scientific, post-positivist point of view. The interview work is really informed by more of a humanities and a constructivist approach. The auditing is, this is coming from computer science, which is very, much more cut and dry and positivist, right? These are different ways. And then we're hoping together that we'll be able to inform kind of a predictive model that is, we call it multi-paradigmatic, right? It's bringing these paradigms together in a way that will be useful to the audience. So this is the timeline we're working on. Like I mentioned, this is a 3-year project. And so we've got multiple components, but they're kind of stacked on top of each other. So our hope is that we'll be able to field the survey in the winter. We're finalizing the drafting, trying to get IRB approval as we speak. Once we do the survey, we'll start the behavioral tracking. We'll do that for a year. And then in winter 2020, we'll field the second survey. We'll stop tracking the behavior online and then start conducting interviews to get some more of that contextual, nuanced information. And then that will bring us to the fall 2022 to start working on that predictive algorithm and have about a year to work on that. So that's what I had planned for that. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I will, actually stop sharing the screen, and I'll kind of transition from that and invite some questions.
Hey, Brian, this is Pete. I want to thank you again for the talk. And it's such a great fit with really the missions of the Public Policy Center, the interdisciplinarity of what you're doing, the policy relevance, the mixed methods, the learning from each other. All of those things are things that we really like to think of the Public Policy Center being in a position to try to help with those things.
Great. Yeah, I'm excited to be a part of it.
And, related to your topic, it seems like it's the kind of thing that we benefit from and we're scared to death of at the same time, these algorithms that are going on, throughout our life. Apple Music just changed their algorithm, and there's like your own radio station now that they put in, and it's fantastic. But then there's a lot of the other things, we only see the things they want us to see and all of that. How do you sort of balance, and how do you think about that? How do you think we should be thinking about this as we're going to be moving into a world that's going to be more and more built this way?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there is a sense in which algorithms becomes kind of the big scary word. It's the algorithms are going to come get us. And algorithms don't necessarily have to have a negative consequence. Like I said, we use algorithms all the time. It's just the ways that we kind of make decisions, that we kind of operate through our daily function. The the real kind of challenge with computer-based algorithms is that the code is a black box, right? And so when iTunes changes its algorithms, they didn't ask you, Pete, how you wanted to experience your music, and then you have no idea what they're doing behind the scenes to make that work. And that's the mysterious and scary part, is that these algorithms are really black boxes. And so when I go onto Facebook, there are some places where I can look and see where Facebook personalizes its ads and what it thinks my interests are. But I don't always understand, at least, where those ideas come from. So there was a point in time where I looked at my Facebook ad preferences, and it's had in my interest hot dogs. I don't know where that came from. Maybe I clicked on a post about hot dogs at some point in time, but I mean, the consequences of that are relatively small, but they can become quite big when we start looking at some of the inequities that may be expressed, right? Maybe I'm being limited in the type of political views I'm seeing. Maybe I'm being limited by the type of racial makeup of the friends that are showing up in my newsfeed, or the gender breakdown of who's being recommended to me. So, it's a roundabout way to answer your question, just to say that the algorithms can be helpful, right? They help us function. But as we take the decision-making processes that used to be handled by humans and given to computers, we need to interrogate the computers in the same way we'd interrogate the people. And for the most part, social media companies don't want you doing that, right? There was actually a lawsuit because doing some of the research that honestly we're doing, that a lot of other people are doing, is breaks the terms of service of these computers and could be prosecuted, or terms of service of these companies, and could be prosecuted by law. And the ACLU teamed up with some researchers, notably Christian Sandvig from Michigan, to sue and say, hey, we need to do this research. And fortunately, they won the case. So, I'm hoping not to go to jail for this research, but that is one of the areas that I think needs to be changed, is that these algorithms need to be opened up to researchers to do these types of experiments and these types of interrogation, because the decision-making process is mysterious and it's unknown, and we need to make that more known.
Yep, makes sense.
Hi, Carolyn.
To unmute myself. Hey, thank you for giving this presentation. I really liked the multi-method. I really liked your different epistemological approaches to knowledge. And obviously the topic is really salient, since I teach politics, and party polarization is moving into what we call extreme party polarization. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to, 2 suggestions and then 1 question. 2 suggestions are the Democracy Fund, that is the eBay, Piero Midier money. They have a voter study group, and they have some recent reports on the percentage of the public that would condone violence against the other party in the case of a lost election, or would condone violence just against an ordinary Republican versus a Democrat, or an elite. And those numbers look like about 2 in 10 Americans. 8 in 10 reject, 2 in 10 would condone. Question, is 2 in 10 a lot? It seems like a lot. So I would definitely go look at that. Lillian Mason, are you familiar with her book, Uncivil Democracy?
No.
Please go take a peep. She comes from a political psychology perspective, from in groups and out groups. And she studies kind of this current environment. And I think it would be really helpful when you do your in-depth interviews, maybe even some of your survey questions, basically those steps of before the dehumanizing the out group is the building, the in-group bonding, the out-group hate. And she talks a lot about social identities anyway. And then just a technical question. is how are you getting participants to allow you to track where they go online? Behavioral track, like that's a high level of,
Oh,
I mean, that's what we're all fighting to not do, is have everybody track our personal. So I was
right.
questioning how you do that.
Yeah, Carolyn, thank you first for the suggestions. I appreciate that. So in terms of the behavioral tracking, there's two possibilities. So we're working with YouGov for the survey, and thank you, Lisa, for connecting us with YouGov. So Rashab and his graduate student had basically designed a browser plugin, so something that you could install in your browser that would track a list of URLs and send them back to us. But would otherwise de-identify the data, right? So you wouldn't have that information, and it would allow users to turn it on and off, and we'd be providing them financial incentives to participate. What we've recently learned is that YouGov has a similar product that they're already using. And I've got a call with YouGov later this week to find out more about the product they use, which is called YouGov Pulse, to see if that will do what we want. Now that maybe gets at the mechanics of it. The ethics of it are going to be, something that as a group we have to spend a lot of time thinking about, making sure that we are doing this ethically and responsibly. And I imagine these are going to be some long conversations I have with the Human Subjects Office here, of making sure that we are doing this responsibly as well. And so I've seen a few studies that have used this pulse data before, and so connecting the tracking data with the survey data. But that's kind of we've designed an initial draft of the survey, so that's kind of the phase we're exploring right now, is looking at that.
We use YouGov. We've used them for a long, long time, and they are definitely a leader. So I would, and just so if you're interested in some of those questions about violence and how in national samples, YouGov actually funds the Cooperative Congressional Election Study, CCES. It's
Okay.
got about 50,000 to 80,000 people. It runs every 2 years, and they have those questions on violence, but they definitely, you know what you're doing really is you're doing like in war. This is what they did during wars to try to figure out like what was the tactics that say that Germany was using in World War II. I mean, it's heavy stuff. So you need multi-method, but YouGov is a good place to be. So
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
thank you.
Brian, just in case you haven't noticed, there are a couple of questions for you in the chat.
Oh, okay. Yeah, let me
know.
take a look at this. Thank you, Leslie. Elizabeth asks, what level of confidence are you requiring to assert your algorithm should be used to audit group behavior on social media? In terms of, I will say, again, this is really Rashab's design, and so I can't speak with as much certainty as he would about this. But I think the idea behind this is I think he had listed maybe looking at like 500 different communities. And so what you have to do is you have to train humans to then look at basically the full kind of lifespan of content on that community. And then he was talking about kind of breaking that lifespan into quartiles. And then once we have kind of that manual coding, then I don't really, to be perfectly honest, again, I don't really understand what the training of the machine learning process looks like and all the statistical levels that are engaged in that, but that's what that is going to look like. I'm not sure if I answered that question, Elizabeth. Feel free to follow up if not. And then the other question, let's see. Yeah, so the question there was another question in the chat about the language that is being used in the survey and testing that. So this has been, what we're trying to do with these 4 positions is we're trying to ask as many questions that are similar to each other as we can, so that we can compare across these 4 different issues. What we found is it's very difficult to come up with the same language to ask questions about, let's say, racial inequality and abortion or climate change, right? We found some ways to ask them similar questions on those issues, but sometimes it feels like we're skirting around the issue a bit. And so what we've done is we've tried to identify existing survey scales that have been validated by previous studies and have been used in previous studies. And so, yeah, the question is about kind of using the language of illegal aliens versus unregistered immigrants. I agree. I find that illegal alien language a little off-putting and outdated. But it is a scale that has been used previously to assess one's views on immigration. And so that, there's something for us to go back and kind of be sure that that's the scale we want to use. But I would certainly bet that if we were to change that language, that would trigger a different response from respondents.
Brian, this is Juliana. How many participants are you hoping to get, and what's going to be your process for getting them? I'm just thinking in terms of like people who might lean toward the radicalization side of things would, I don't know, you're going to end up with like some people who aren't comfortable, like who don't want to participate. So how will you get a good pool of participants?
Yeah, so we'll be working with YouGov for the survey, and YouGov basically has their set of panelists that they work with that answer a number of their different surveys. We're going to be starting with 1,600 respondents from the first wave because we want basically 1,000 respondents over the 2 waves of the study. So assuming we're going to get some attrition from the first survey to the second, we've overloaded that first sample to get us there. The filtering language we've used to get us folks that I think we would be most interested in has to do with their knowledge or their engagement in political issues. So in short, the people we're going to be recruiting are folks who already take surveys through YouGov and are engaged or knowledgeable about politics. So there is as Carolyn was saying, we're seeing like 2 out of 10 in recent studies that would support violent behavior. So we're not expecting 1,600 radical participants, right? We may only get a few. And that's partially why we are focused more on the radicalization rather than radicals, because we can see the change over time, and that will occur for all participants. There may be some people that stay the same, some people that become less radicalized, some people that become more radicalized, as opposed to hitting a certain threshold where we would identify someone as radical. In terms of the plugin and the interviews, we're going to be taking a subsample of the survey respondents. So at the end of the first wave of the survey, we'll ask people if they are interested in participating in this additional component. And if it's Pulse, YouGov will kind of manage that. If it's our plugin, we'll manage that, and we'll provide compensation for people to do that, somewhere in the realm of $10 a month for a year to do that. And so the budget will kind of dictate those numbers, but we were estimating about 150, so a smaller number of that. And then for the interviews, it's just impossible to interview 1,000 people, and it's not necessarily that helpful at that point because you just kind of lose track. So we're hoping to interview about 100 of those folks. And so we'll be able to, again, ask if they are interested in participating in that component of the study, but we'll be able to identify a very kind of deliberate sample, likely to be a maximum variation sample, so we can identify people who maybe opinions didn't change, or people whose opinions changed quite a bit in one direction or the other. People who interact with media in a variety of different ways. And so we're looking at about 100. And again, we'll provide some financial compensation for people for participating in interviews.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Does anybody have more questions for Brian?
Oh, I see a question in the chat. Yeah, and so the question is about kind of, I guess, that definition of radicalization. And this is, this is something that, we've had a lot of conversations about, and in particular, because we're funded by the Department of Defense, something we've wanted to be really kind of thoughtful about as well, because what we are interested in, and I could step back a little bit. One of the driving interests of this group was the relationship between race and algorithms, right? So Tim Havens is a scholar of race, and Raven Mirage Lloyd, also a scholar of digital media and race, and thinking about kind of this relationship between algorithms and race. And so when we started thinking about race and algorithms, we were really thinking about white supremacy, right? But we wanted to think about it in a broader sense as well. And so we're certainly less interested in, radical Islamic extremism, which is a category of radicalization which has gotten a lot of study. And so we were looking at issues around race, issues around gender, and then issues around environment, which got us to these topics of race, immigration, abortion, and climate change. And so I think these three dimensions, we spoke to Kurt Braddock, who's at American University, who has been doing research in radicalization. And this framework of three dimensions of radicalization, I thought was really helpful, so that we can distinguish the difference between someone who has a strong viewpoint, right? That doesn't make them a radical, right? It's having a strong viewpoint, having that viewpoint be very far outside of the mainstream, and then condoning violent means to achieve those ends, right? And so someone can be engaged in activism in an opinion that they feel very strongly about. We're not necessarily trying to make a negative connotation about that. But if they combine each of these three and they start to move into unlawful or violent behavior, that's what we would categorize as radicalization. Now, someone might be radicalized in a direction that I agree with, but it doesn't make that any less antisocial. And so that was something we've been trying to kind of keep in mind as well. The topics we're interested in, the biases that we come with as researchers, and making sure that we're leaving room for kind of a broader and more nuanced understanding of radicalization than is maybe typically used or typically associated with that term.
I was just going to suggest that in my world, there's quite a bit of a connection of work between harassment as a first step before violence, and the way you're doing your tools, acceptance of types of harassment, intimidation, right? So that's, I don't know, you probably already addressed this, but just something to think about.
No, that's great, Carolyn. And so this it's called the ARIS scale, which is being used in a lot of contemporary radicalization research. And so it has like a series of statements that involve activist activity, and then a series of statements that involve radical or violent activity. One of the things we're trying to do is, in addition to adding kind of a digital version of that, is we're trying to add a subscale of that has to do with what we would consider to be symbolic violence, right? And that gets at some of the stuff that you're talking about, Carolyn. So harassment, name calling, dehumanizing, right? Actions that can be taken against someone that aren't necessarily punching someone in the face, but have serious psychological consequences of it. And so that's one of the things we're playing with right now is, what does that symbolic violence look like in physical life, and what might that look like in online or digital life, right? And so that can be in digital, it might be unfriending someone, it might be reporting a post, even though it doesn't go against the terms of service of the site, right? So, one of our colleagues was saying, sometimes when I see stuff that I don't agree with, I just report it as violating the terms of service, just because I don't want to see it anymore. Right. So there's various activities like that that are maybe lower level responses, but are certainly indicative of a type of behavior as well.
And the polls show that there's more tolerance for this type of harassment than there is for straight out violence, but they are like really related. And it would be interesting if your work can show where on those kind of decision trees, evolution. And of course, your work on the personalization is just so critical in trying to sort out how these communities tip. So.
Thank you again. And yeah, and one of the statements, we're looking at for our version of the ARIS scale is looking at who's the target of the activity. And so you might support attacks against an organization or a business that disagrees with your views, right? So you see people take on media industry or a private corporation, right? And then a different one would be attacking an individual, right? So I might be willing to flame or harass a corporation, but if I'm going to flame or harass an individual, right, that's a different level, right? Taking it out on a specific person. And of course, we see people do that, right? Particularly, we see it happen against like individual journalists or individuals who are, open about sharing their opinions online. But yeah, that's something that we're looking at as well, the tactics, the target of the tactics as well. Well, I realize folks have busy lives, and so I appreciate you coming in and paying attention and asking questions. And this is, anytime I present my work and I get questions, it always gives me stuff to kind of wrestle with and think about and improve and make it better. So thanks to the PPC for giving the opportunity, and thanks to you all for your comments and questions. I really appreciate it.